This lecture is part of the Keystone seminar at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young, the instructor. This lecture is devoted to an examination of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the 18th century political theorist, novelist, opera writer, sort of Renaissance man, I suppose we could say, and specifically to the assigned text for this week, which is the Discourse on Inequality. Rousseau was a pivotal figure in the 18th century, though I think he's also been misunderstood. Rousseau is often intimately linked with the French Revolution, as if he were, leading the crowds in their overthrow of the aristocracy. In fact, he died more than a decade before the revolution. He was not widely read by those who began the revolution. He does seem to have been read by some who were involved in the revolution. And so, we need to be aware that there is a connection. The connection itself is spurious. We also need to ask the question of whether Rousseau would have approved of the revolution in the form that it took between 1789 and 1795 or so. I think that it's arguable that he would not have approved of that. First of all, Paris was a large city. He never felt truly at home in Paris. He came from Geneva originally and saw a small city as the most likely place for the playing out of his theories politically. And Paris was simply too large, to say nothing of France as a country, which he would have found sort of impossible to reconcile with his ideas about government and about the properly ordered society. But we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves here. We want to start with looking at Rousseau's life and talk about the influence it had on him. Rousseau definitely was a self-reflective person, and so his life, I think even more than with Locke, is important for understanding why he feels the way he does about things like human nature and civil society. Why he describes the state of nature the way he does, why he is and has the views of government that he has. Unlike Locke, Rousseau was not formally educated. He was born in Geneva. His father was a craftsman, and Rousseau himself, his mother died when he was only 9 days old. His father not long after. His father actually abandoned him when he was still a child, and Rousseau ended up being put into the care of various relatives. When he was 15 years old, he went with some friends on a jaunt outside of Geneva. And when they returned to the city, they found that the gates had been locked because it was late in the evening. And rather than simply spend a chilly night out in the cold and wait for the gates to open in the morning, Rousseau decided to leave Geneva and to strike it out somewhere else. Now, keep in mind, he's only 15 years old at the time. This is really quite a remarkable thing. And so he left, and he eventually ended up in Turin, in northern Italy, or what was then known as Savoie, and spent some time there, became an apprentice in crafts, also developed an interest in music and some other things, but this life was difficult for him, and so he eventually returned to Geneva, though not actually to the city, to the environs of Geneva, where he came into the company of an older woman who he saw as a kind of mother figure, although she did eventually become his mistress, which Rousseau felt uncomfortable with, but she was 13 years older than him, and this was a kind of wealthy aristocratic woman who had a large library, and this is really where Rousseau had his education, was the years he spent there consulting the library, reading as much as he possibly could. He ended up for much of his adult life in Paris, though he went back at times to Geneva. Rousseau was a controversial figure. Many of the things that he wrote were not well received by the authorities. Some of the things he wrote, for instance, was perceived to be atheistic. and on the basis of religion, he was exiled from various places. Some of the things he wrote were also perceived to be criticisms of the governments of the various places he lived, and so he was at times exiled from cities for that reason. His life becomes quite complex. It would take too long really to go through kind of a full narrative of this. But suffice it to say that Rousseau, spent time in a lot of different places. For a time, late in his life, he became the guest of David Hume, the great English empirical philosopher, and Hume set him up on an estate in Staffordshire in England. But he had a falling out with Hume, partly because he perceived that Hume was using him as a way to enrich himself, that he was appealing to people to help Rousseau, and then pocketing the money. And so he left England actually in disguise, returned to Paris. For a time he lived under an assumed name. He had a very interesting life, a very exciting life, I think we could say. And it's one that this varied experience he had certainly influenced his thinking about human nature and about politics. Rousseau had a different relationship to religion than many of his contemporaries, and I'll have more to say about this in a moment here when we talk about the text, but he began life in Geneva as a Calvinist. Geneva was, from the 16th century on, a very kind of a Calvinist stronghold. In fact, it had been set up as a sort of Calvinist utopia during the life of John Calvin himself. But after going to France, no, it wasn't. It was before that. During his time, I think, in Turin, he converted to Catholicism, and was a Catholic for a time, and then later on, upon a return to Geneva, he once again became a Calvinist. And so he experimented with different forms of religion, and he seems to have absorbed religious teachings and had a great affinity for these things. And although he, like many of his contemporary philosophers and theorists, was skeptical of some aspects of religion, Rousseau doesn't seem to have gone in, for instance, for the doctrine of the fall of mankind, which was the explanation for evil. He goes back to human nature instead, and looks at it from that angle rather than accepting this theological explanation. But he seems to have had a much greater affinity for religion, seen it as necessary, unlike some of his contemporaries, particularly Voltaire, who was one of the chief critics of Rousseau. During his time in Paris and in other places he traveled to, he came into contact with other important thinkers of the era. When he first went to Paris, for instance, he fell in with the circle that was headed by Denis Diderot and Jean d'Alembert, who were compiling in the 1750s and 1760s an encyclopedia. In fact, this is where the term encyclopedia comes from. This was a collection of all knowledge. Rousseau contributed articles on politics and music to the encyclopedia, though he later also had a falling out with Diderot and d'Alembert over a variety of issues. He was critical of some of the things that they had written and ended up making enemies of them. Same thing happened with David Hume, who was an admirer of Rousseau and an interlocutor. Hume invited him to England, as I said, but then they had a falling out, and Rousseau had to leave England in disguise and sort of in the middle of the night. I don't think he was ever friends with Voltaire. Rather, they were sort of public enemies. Voltaire criticized Rousseau, found many of his sentiments about virtue to be quite dyspeptic. And Voltaire, it seems, also saw Rousseau as a hypocrite. Rousseau took up a very long relationship at one point with a laundress named Thérèse, and ended up fathering 5 children with her, and very late in his life he married her. But with each of the children, he convinced Thérèse to take them to an orphanage, essentially to abandon their children shortly after they were born. And with the combined force of Rousseau and the mother of Thérèse, she caved into this. And Rousseau later wrote a work called, it was a novel actually, called Émile, which was about the education of a young man. It was a best-selling novelist. It was widely read all over France. And there he talks about the raising of children and the proper education of a child, and goes on and on about educational theory. And up to that point, he had kept secret the fact that he had essentially abandoned his children. Well, this became, somebody leaked that, and this became public knowledge, and Voltaire and other opponents of Rousseau ended up using that as ammunition to criticize him publicly. He, to sum it up, he had relationships with various other important thinkers, but often ended up making enemies of them because he himself was a rather bellicose individual, it seems. Rousseau fits into a kind of triumvirate of great political philosophers of the 17th and 18th century. It starts with Hobbes, and then to Locke, and then finally to Rousseau, often in introductory classes on political theory. These are the first 3 thinkers that are read, maybe the sum total of assignments in a class like that. Rousseau has, fittingly, I think, been included with those other 2. Whereas Hobbes is seen as the great political theorist in defense of absolute monarchy. Locke is associated with the American Revolution, and particularly with American and English forms of government. And Rousseau is seen as the godfather of the French Revolution. All 3 of those attributions are in some way problematic, but the associations are very, very strong. And so the modern democratic forms of government, the kind of theories behind them, often go back to Locke and Rousseau, and as a counterpoint to Hobbes. And Rousseau certainly was aware of the thinking of Hobbes and Locke. He responds to them. He doesn't necessarily mention them by name, but it's quite obvious that he's thinking about them, particularly in the Discourse on Inequality, which is the assignment for this class. Sorry for the yawn. His works, this is not an exhaustive list. Rousseau actually, as I said, was interested in a variety of things. For a time he tried to make money through writing music, and he even wrote a couple of full operas. It seems that he was not a particularly skilled musician or composer, but had a passion for it, and there were some who found his music to be quite tasteful. In fact, at one point he was offered a kind of court position under a French aristocrat to come and write music there, and Rousseau turned it down, and many of his contemporaries thought he was crazy to do that because he didn't necessarily have a steady source of income, and that would have set him up for the rest of his life probably. But on principle, Rousseau turned that opportunity down. He's probably most famous for his work called The Social Contract. And here, this is not a new topic, of course. Both Hobbes and Rousseau were theorists of the social contract. But Rousseau takes a very different stance on the social contract than Hobbes or Locke do. For one, he is much more optimistic about human nature, and he doesn't see that civil society needs to be created as a check on the baser instincts of human beings, which are destructive. Rousseau. I keep mixing these names up. Rousseau sees human nature actually as something that's rather more benign or even virtuous. So the social contract for him is a way to extend the virtues that already exist potentially in human nature. An opportunity for mankind, or for individual man, sorry for the non-gender neutral terms here, these are the terms that he used, but for each individual man to bind himself to a community in full commitment, being willing to sacrifice anything so that the greater good could be brought about. Unlike Hobbes and Locke, who see social contract benefiting individual desires, Rousseau feels that the state of nature already takes care of individual desires just fine, that it's actually a kind of idyllic and positive place. The only reason that mankind would enter into a social contract then is to create a collective benefit, to exercise another part of human nature which he calls pity. And this, the establishing oneself as part of a social contract then allows for the greater good of all mankind to be brought about, or at least for those who are members of the community. In his social contract, he does not, this is limited to a particular kind of political space. He sees the small city rather than a large entity like a kingdom or nationalism is really sort of in its formative stages as a theory and as a concept at this point, but something so complex as a nation would not fit very well under Rousseau's terms of social contract, which is why attributing the thinking behind the French Revolution to him is problematic. That's one of the reasons anyway. The Discourse on Inequality we'll talk about in a few minutes here, but it was written before the social contract and contains his theories on human nature and on why it's necessary to enter into civil society, or why that might be advantageous. He also wrote a number of other works that often bucked the trends of his time. And many of these were written as essays for essay competitions, which were really quite popular in the 18th century. He's not the only figure who wrote in that sort of context. In his Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, for instance, he holds that the study of arts and sciences is actually a negative thing because it brings about pride. It brings about what he calls amour propre, or self-love, which is, in his mind, a destructive force. That the pursuit of arts and sciences produces pride, that it makes one who is educated in that manner feel that he or she is superior to all others, and he sees that pride or self-love as a destructive force in society, as we'll talk about in a moment here. And so he's not very keen on kind of what we might call liberal education here, because it creates an inequality among people. I talked about Emile. He also wrote a kind of romantic novel that was a bestseller called Juliette. Really, in his lifetime, in fact, probably all the way up to the beginning of the French Revolution, people would have known Rousseau on the basis of the popularity of his novels, or something that he published toward the end of his life, a work called Confessions, which was a kind of autobiography or a memoir of his life. It's a highly detailed account of his experience. This was also a bestseller. And so his political theory, which is his most enduring legacy, was not well known in his lifetime or even in the aftermath of his life. It was only some decades after, I think, that more people began to read the Discourse on Inequality and the Social Contract for what they had to say about politics. And so his influence is mixed and a debatable point. The one figure in the French Revolution who did embrace Rousseau and seems to have read him and sponsored him was Maximilien Robespierre. who was the leader of the Committee of Public Safety during the Reign of Terror. In fact, there have been studies done of the publication of Rousseau's works, and we see that there's a kind of spike in the publishing of the Discourse on Inequality and the Social Contract during that time, largely because of the sponsorship of Robespierre. That before that, these were not widely circulated. Rather, Émile and Juliette were, as was Confessions, but the political theory texts were not. For some reason, Robespierre found him compelling. There is, of course, some debate over whether Rousseau is, in the mind of somebody like Robespierre, a construction, or whether Robespierre takes him at his word and really follows what Rousseau says. I think it's quite obvious that Rousseau became, for a radical like Robespierre, more of a construction than something that was authentic. Okay, so let's talk about the Discourse on Inequality. I'm going to fit both. I had intended for there to be 2 lectures on Rousseau, one on his life and one on Discourse on Inequality, but I'll go ahead and merge these together into a single lecture here. A few things preliminarily to actually delving into the text itself. First of all, as I hinted at earlier, Rousseau was a critic, I should say, of some of the aspects of Enlightenment thought. Unlike Voltaire and others who were not only skeptical but rejecting of traditional religion entirely. These figures were often deists if they had any religious sentiment at all. That is, that they felt that there was a God who perhaps created the universe but was not interested in what happened subsequently, certainly was not involved in human life, that it was left up to the reasonable capacities of man to prosper. And some of this had to do with Locke's teaching about blank slate and other things, although Locke himself had religious sentiments that he carried with him through his life. Rousseau, on the other hand, was a strict devotee of a concept that he called virtue, which really comes out of sort of traditional religious sentiments. He feels that it is actually part of human nature to have compassion on others. And so he was seen as a little too embracing of religion by some of his critics, particularly Voltaire, who again saw him as a hypocrite for what he'd done with his children. And so Rousseau really never compromised on this, though he was critical of some aspects of traditional Christian theology. Even more important, I think, in terms of Rousseau's relationship with the Enlightenment, is his skepticism of progress. And I think I talked about this in the lecture on Locke in kind of this introduction to Enlightenment. But Enlightenment thinkers felt that they were in every way superior, not sort of intrinsically superior, but because of the societies they had created, the things they had discovered, the knowledge they now possessed, both scientific and political, and the advances that humankind had made in the scientific revolution and through the Enlightenment, that they lived better lives, that human beings had actually arrived at a more advanced state than had ever existed in the history of the world, in the history of mankind. And this is a departure from Renaissance thought, which looked back at the ancient world as the great model for civilization. Enlightenment thought said, we have transcended even the ancients, even the ancient Greeks and Romans. Rousseau was skeptical of this. He didn't see this supposed progress as a positive thing. He saw this as simply a means to create greater inequality because it meant that some people had things that others didn't, and it wasn't just about possessions necessarily, though that was a contributing factor to the inequality. It was about the conceptions that people had. That some people considered themselves superior to others. In other words, they had greater pride or greater self-love on the basis of what they had achieved, on the basis of this notion of progress. Now, Rousseau was not necessarily a kind of early critic of Western supersessionism or Western ideas of superiority. I mean, he saw, and he even says it in a couple of points in his texts that the peoples of the northern parts of the world seem to be superior in achievement to others. Though he's not saying that that's necessarily a good thing. He was, it should be said, a critic of slavery on the basis of these same sorts of thoughts, that by human nature all men are equal, and so therefore enslavement is a bad thing, even if we're talking about people who are not Europeans. And so he was critical of those who touted the progress that humankind had made. He was a wet blanket on the great optimism of Enlightenment thought, I suppose. It should also be said, as a preliminary comment, that Rousseau addresses this text to Geneva, and specifically to the rulers of Geneva, with whom he had various fallings out over the course of his life. Geneva was for him the exact kind of setting in which his political theories were supposed to work. In his mind, that was the sort of place where these things should be attempted, where a social contract, as he envisioned it, would work, where the attempt to create a society that was that transcended inequality would potentially succeed. Though the construction of Geneva that he paints in the introduction or the address section of the text, the first few pages, is not necessarily the Geneva that he knew, the Geneva that actually existed, which was marked by inequality, but rather a potential Geneva that Rousseau envisioned in his mind and was trying to win other people over to. So here, his own experience with his home city. In fact, Rousseau, throughout his life, signed his documents, his books, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, citizen of Geneva. Even though he spent very little time as an adult there, he always considered himself to be part of Geneva, though the Geneva that he felt he was a citizen of was this construct that he had in his own mind, rather than something that existed in reality. So to the text itself, in part 1, just as Locke does in his second treatise of government, Rousseau explores human nature by going back to ideas about the state of nature. Now, here he differs in some respects from Locke. Locke saw this, in his exploration of the state of nature, he seems to take this as an actual historical thing, that mankind started out this way and then developed. For Rousseau, his discussion of the state of nature is not necessarily grounded in anything that he would call historical reality. This is really just, in fact, at one point he even says this is a hypothetical state of nature. I'm not talking about anything that really existed here. But the difference there is really sort of a trivial point, I suppose, because for them the real goal in exploring the state of nature was to come to some conclusions about some of the basic aspects of human nature. And in this respect, Rousseau is a good deal more optimistic than Locke, and exponentially more optimistic than Hobbes. Hobbes had seen human nature as a kind of dark and savage condition. The basic facet of human nature in the state of nature for Hobbes was survival, really kind of survival of the fittest, long before Darwin. where people would just kill each other for the sake of gaining what others had. And so it's a constant state of warfare. Now Locke, as we've seen, is a little more positive about human nature and about the state of nature. He sees this as a state that is governed by reason, where all people are equal. However, he does say that when people start to obtain property, then they and the obtaining of property for Locke happens in the state of nature, that they arrive at inequalities and ultimately come to the state of war, which is what he sees as particularly problematic. And so he eventually ends up in the same place as Hobbes does. He just does it through a more circuitous route. For Rousseau, the state of nature is this truly idyllic situation where mankind, or individual man, I think is what he's really talking about here, seeks to meet his basic needs. What are the basic needs? Well, food, shelter, and sex. Those are the basic needs. And once each man fulfills those things, he's happy. He doesn't worry about anything else. He lives in this kind of idyllic existence where he's able to carry out those things that he holds dear, which are the meeting of the basic needs. He is governed by two things, though, and the first of these is very much in keeping with the state of nature. The second is not necessarily in keeping with the state of nature. The first instinct is what he calls self-preservation, and that means that he desires that he continue to live, right? That he have his basic needs met, that he not starve to death, that he is able to procreate, though he doesn't necessarily take, and again, sorry for the general neutral language here, he does talk about this in the masculine, and I'm trying to be generic, as generic as I can about this, but the individual man has his, seeks to meet his basic needs, and that's all he's really concerned about. But another aspect of human nature that Rousseau opines is fundamental is what he calls pity. That is, he does not like to see any other being, and particularly a sentient being, like a fellow human being, suffer. And so he will not necessarily, he will not, even if, and so, sorry, let me back up here. Pity is to some extent at odds, or at least it can be, with self-preservation. Because if there is a limited amount of food, or something like that, then, two people or more people are going to fight over this, and the instinct for self-preservation may trump the instinct for pity. But in general, in the state of nature, much as Locke opines, there is enough for everyone to go around. Now, Rousseau calls this state the state of savagery. Unlike other Enlightenment thinkers who used savagery as a pejorative, as a kind of rubric for talking about peoples who had not reached any stage of advancement, who were just trying to have their basic needs met, who lived in this sort of state of nature that Hobbes talks about, where it's a dog-eat-dog world and everybody's trying to kill each other in competition for basic necessities. So that's not that's not what Rousseau envisions when he talks about savagery. Rather, savagery is a stage of human existence which is beyond the basic animal existence. So he seems to see an evolution of mankind here. Again, this is a century before Darwin. But he starts out as just not really differentiated from other animals, and then he reaches this stage of savagery where he's content simply to have his basic needs met. He doesn't yet have language or the other things that would allow him to interact on a deep level with other human beings. The only interaction between human beings is sex or potentially competition over basic necessities. So, now, what happens to create inequality then, is the question. Well, he says, in the state of nature, there is a built-in inequality. And that inequality comes from the fact that not all people are created the same physically. That some people have a physical advantage if they can run faster, or go longer without sleep, or go longer without eating, they have a higher tolerance for hunger or something like that, then this will give them an advantage. But in the state of nature, where there is an abundance of things, this isn't necessarily a problem, and this physical inequality doesn't compromise life to the point where it becomes unbearable, where it becomes difficult, and there needs to be a solution to the inequality. The other type of inequality he sees, and the one that he's most concerned about, only comes about when mankind enters into society. And this is not so much an inequality of possessions, though that is, again, an aspect of this. Rather, it's a conceptual inequality where one person comes to think that he or she is better than another person. Or, collectively speaking, one group of people comes to think that they are better than other groups of people, or something like that. And it's this conceptual inequality that Rousseau is concerned about. And he says this is only possible once mankind enters into society, once they begin to interact with each other, once they develop language, and once they enter into direct competition with each other, not just over resources, basic necessities, but over what he calls wealth, or he also uses the word luxury. Reason is also an aspect of this, because in the state of savagery, mankind doesn't necessarily partake in reason. Reason is preliminary to this advancing into society, and Rousseau actually sees he sees this stage of development when mankind develops his capacity for reason and begins to develop language and begins to interact with everybody, but there's still enough stuff out there for everybody's basic needs to be met, such that they're not yet in competition with each other, and they haven't conceived yet of they haven't reached the point where they're conceiving of each other as unequal, but they do have the capacity to reason at that point. And Rousseau says, gosh, I wish we could have stayed in that state. And in fact, the society or the political system that he creates is an attempt to move back to that state, because in that state, the two basic facets of human nature, self-preservation and pity, are both possible. Human beings are interacting with each other, and so they can let that pity they feel for each other, the desire for the welfare of another, to be played out, but they can also meet their need for self-preservation without compromising the self-preservation of others. And that's the idyllic situation that Rousseau kind of pines for at times. Now, reason, much as with Locke, is an aspect of inequality in that it takes the capacity of reasoning to conceive of inequality. And again, for Rousseau, the conception is the important thing. It's not just the difference in material possessions. Now, Locke saw property as something that existed in the state of nature. Because in the state of nature, mankind could, if you recall from Locke, perform labor, and labor was the prerequisite for claiming property, right? Well, Rousseau leaves the question of labor to the side. And again, it's not about accumulation, it's really not about physical effort, it's about conception. And he says this, and I'm quoting directly here, this is page 69 of the Hackett edition, if you're using that one. The first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took it into his head to say, "This is mine." Now, think on the words there, took it into his head. That's the important thing. It's not the laying claim to the property, it's taking it into his head. It's conceiving that this is mine and not yours. Continuing with the quote here, and found people simple enough to believe him was the true founder of civil society. Civil society for Rousseau is not necessarily a good thing. Because he goes on to say, what crimes, wars, murders, what miseries and horrors would the human race have been spared had someone pulled up the stakes or filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow men, do not listen to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all and the earth to no one. So property for Rousseau, and again, not the physical property, but the conception of property, the differentiating between one person and another, is the root of inequality. And he sees this also as the root of evil. Now, there are a couple of stages of development here, and really these are negative developments. Rousseau talks about the development of, or the procuring of wealth and luxury. In fact, this is to return to his comments on education, particularly as it relates to the arts and sciences. If a person has the luxury to sit and read or sit and think when others don't, then that is a fundamental state of inequality, and that's a problem. That a person might think that he or she can spend his or her time just sitting around reading rather than engaging in physical labor like everybody else. That is a fundamental inequality, and that's corrosive to the better aspects of human nature. This is a step toward the development of what Rousseau calls self-love or pride, that is destructive to the basic self-preservation and pity which exist in this tension with each other in basic human nature. Society leads. Now, this isn't necessarily all negative. Because while society can lead to vice, lead to these conceptions of one person being better than another, one person having more by right or by privilege than another, one person being able to do things that others can't, that's the vice. That's the inequality that society creates. But on the other hand, society can augment the ability to play out the commendable aspect of human nature, which is pity or compassion. And if mankind is able to create a society via the creation of a government wherein that virtuous task can be pursued or must be pursued by all people who are part of that society, then the creation of that society is a good thing. Okay, so society leads to both vice and virtue, or the potential for vice and the potential for virtue, and so governments must be created that lead to virtue rather than vice. Okay. Now, it's at this point that Rousseau differentiates, and he elaborates on this more in The Social Contract, between what he calls love of self, which is really just the instinct of self-preservation that exists in human nature, and self-love. And we could also use the word pride. And I forget what the exact words that the edition here uses. I think it's something like egocentrism. That's the translation of amour propre, which is the French there. But this self-love or pride, conceiving of oneself as better than another on the basis of having more possessions or being able to do something that others can't, or holding a position that others cannot hold. Really, this is the ultimate expression of individuality here, is problematic, is wrong, because it means that human beings are fundamentally unequal, and that their basic rights of equality are compromised. On the other hand, again, to underscore a point that I made a minute ago, virtue equals commitment to society. And this means full commitment. It's not, well, I'm going to leave aside some things for myself. It is full commitment to the community, to the commune. Being willing to sacrifice all things for the greater good of others. That's what government must create. It must create the conditions wherein that's not coerced, but rather where all people feel this equal commitment to the society, where responsibility is collective, where people are not differentiated from one another. And so later, in the later part of the work, he talks about different forms of government. He talks about monarchy, about despotism, about oligarchy, and about democracy. And ultimately, democracy is the one that can create this virtuous commitment to society, which he sees as the basis of citizenship. But this is only possible, again, in a small town, a small city, which also coincidentally is the ideal situation for education, as he talks about in his novel Emile. That's really the kind of community that he was most positive about and saw the most potential in. So, what happened with the French Revolution probably would have been abhorrent to Rousseau. He would have seen this as the bastardization or the corruption of his ideas, the kind of fundamental misunderstanding and misplacement of his theories into a project that was ultimately destructive, which did, even though it said it was creating conditions of equality, it did differentiate between people on the basis of putting, aristocrats to death and such, and also creating, systems of government that were unequal in many ways. Okay, hopefully that helps us make sense of Rousseau, and we can begin to explore this and look forward to the discussions on the discussion board.